Greetings everyone! We had the chance to look at another boss on the 5.2 PTR, so we're bringing you this preview of it. The fight is against Megaera, a corrupted cloud serpent. Even though the boss might be a cloud serpent, the fight plays like you're fighting a hydra. That said, you are either going to love or hate this boss. Here we go. You never actually fight Megaera herself, but instead you have to fight her many heads. Hydra, remember? There are 3 types of heads, and you can see all 3 of them on the screen right now before the pull. There is a frost damage based head called a frozen head, a nature damage based head called a venomous head, and a fire damage based head called a flaming head. Whenever one head is killed, Megaera loses 10% of her health, so you will need to kill 10 heads to defeat the encounter. There can never be more than 3 heads present here near the platform, but there can never be fewer than 2 either. So, when you kill 2 heads, Megaera respawns all 3, and this carries on until the end of the fight. Every time you kill a head, 2 heads of the same type spawn at the back of the cave, where they cannot be attacked and they just damage your raid for the remainder of the fight. We should emphasize this distinction further. There will always be 2 or 3 heads that you can attack and kill near the platform, and an increasing number of heads that you cannot attack at the back of the cave. This means that as you kill more and more heads near the platform, more and more heads will be piling up at the back, making the fight harder as it goes on. Whenever one head is killed, the other heads that are near the platform are healed to full health, much like the bosses and the protectors of the Endless encounter or in the Iron Council encounter in Ulduar before that. So cleaving and multi-dotting are not beneficial unless they somehow boost your single target DPS. Each head has 3 abilities and a melee attack. They each have a raid-wide damaging attack that they spam, which they only use when there are 3 heads near the platform, and only those heads that are near the platform use this ability. When there are only 2 heads near the platform, these 2 heads use melee attacks and also use a specific breath attack each. Finally, the heads that are at the back of the cave each have a specific ability that they use. So, when the fight starts, you're going to be up against 3 heads, 1 of each kind, all of them attackable. They will use their raid-wide AoE damaging spell, so at this point the raid is taking AoE damage from 3 sources: frost, nature, and fire. As we mentioned, when 1 head is killed, 2 heads of the same type will appear in the fog at the back of the cave and remain there until the end of the fight. For example, when you kill a venomous head, as we are doing here, 2 venomous heads will appear at the back of the cave. At this point, there are only 2 heads left by the platform. These heads now begin to use their melee attacks and their breath attacks. Let's talk about the abilities. Each head has a breath attack, which is extremely damaging and which applies a stacking debuff on the affected targets. This means that you will need to perform a tank switch between the 2 heads. At the same time, the heads that have appeared at the back of the cave are casting their specific ability from there. In this case, we have 2 venomous heads at the back. Their ability is called Acid Rain. It fires a ball of acid at the location of a random raid member, which deals raid-wide nature damage when it lands. The damage is lower the farther away players are from the impact location. Both of the venomous heads at the back are casting this ability at the raid. The frozen head casts Torrent of Ice when it is at the back of the cave. This is a beam of frost that targets and chases a random raid member for 8 seconds, dealing damage at the point of impact and leaving behind damaging ice void zones. Standing in these void zones, called Icy Ground, deals damage and stacks a debuff on the player which reduces movement speed. The flaming head applies a debuff called Cinders on random raid members when it is at the back of the cave. While active, the debuff deals high damage every second to that player. Also, players who are affected by this debuff cause Icy Ground void zones to despawn when they run through them. Dispelling the debuff causes a fiery void zone to be left on the ground. These fiery void zones are extinguished if the torrent of ice cast by the frozen head passes through them. That's a lot to take in. So, what does it all mean? It means that whoever is being chased by the torrent of ice needs to kite it sensibly and leave the void zones in areas that are not problematic, so not in melee range or other bad places. If there are any fiery void zones on the ground, then the player being chased by the torrent should try to kite it over these fiery void zones to extinguish them. The players who are debuffed by Cinders will need to run over the Icy Ground void zones to get rid of them. The damage from Cinders is high though, so these players can only hold on to the debuff for a few seconds before they need to be dispelled. Finally, the players affected by Cinders should try to be in a safe position when they get dispelled, so that they don't drop their void zones in a bad place. Regarding Acid Bomb, the only thing to do is make sure that you aren't too close to the point of impact when it lands. There's more than this though. Earlier I mentioned that the fight gets harder and harder the longer it goes on. There are two reasons for this. First of all, the more heads you kill, the more heads will be gathering up at the back of the cave. That means that you're going to have to deal with more and more abilities cast by these heads. Secondly, whenever a new head of a certain type is created, all heads of that type gain a stack of a buff that increases their damage done by 10% per stack. So as you can tell, the fight becomes harder as it goes on, reaching its difficulty peak right as you are fighting the last head that you need to kill. There are two more abilities in the fight. One that punishes the raid greatly if there is no one in melee range of a head when there are only two heads near to the platform, that is to say, when the heads melee and need to be tanked, and one which causes all heads to deal increased damage for 20 seconds after one head is killed. If this fight seems complicated, that's because it is. On the PTR it was also quite tightly tuned. The damage of certain abilities was very high, although some others felt like they could have been more damaging, particularly the Acid Rain, from which you need to run only a very short distance to remain safe. Hopefully we were able to convey to you the idea behind this encounter. Rest assured that we will be releasing a guide based on the live version of the fight as soon as patch 5.2 is released. Thank you for watching and remember to subscribe.